The gunshot cracked through the summer air like thunder splitting the sky, and Lucian Garrett reined his horse to a sudden halt on the dusty trail outside Council Bluffs, Iowa, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster before he realized the sound came from somewhere beyond the cottonwood trees lining the river. It was July 1878, and the afternoon heat shimmered off the Missouri River in waves that made the distant Nebraska shore look like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. Lucian had been riding for 3 days straight, coming back from a cattle drive that had taken him clear down to Kansas City, and every muscle in his body ached for a hot bath and a soft bed at the boarding house on Main Street. But something about that gunshot didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the sharp report of an experienced shooter. It was hesitant, uncertain, followed by a long silence that suggested frustration rather than confidence. He guided his roan gelding off the main trail and through the stand of trees, the horse's hooves crunching on the dried grass that carpeted the ground beneath the shade. The sound of the river grew louder, and then he heard it again. Another shot just as uncertain as the first, followed by what sounded distinctly like a woman's voice, muttering something he couldn't quite make out. Lucian emerged from the trees into a small clearing that sloped down toward the water's edge. What he saw made him pull up short and just stare for a moment. A woman stood about 30 yards away, her back to him, holding a revolver in both hands like it might explode at any second. She wore a simple calico dress the color of wheat, and her dark hair was pulled back in a braid that hung down between her shoulder blades. Empty tin cans were lined up on a fallen log near the water, not a single one of them disturbed. As he watched, she raised the gun again, her whole body tensing with the effort. The shot went wide, kicking up dirt at least 3 feet to the left of her targets. She lowered the weapon with a sound of pure exasperation that carried clearly across the clearing. "Damn it all," she said, loud enough for him to hear. Then she seemed to notice something was wrong with her grip, adjusted her hands on the revolver, and tried to line up another shot. Lucian cleared his throat. "Pardon me, miss, but you keep shooting like that. You might hit someone in the next county." She spun around so fast she nearly dropped the gun, her eyes wide with alarm. They were the color of honey in sunlight, he noticed, and currently blazing with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with a face that was pretty in an unconventional way, all sharp cheekbones and a determined chin that jutted forward slightly as she regarded him. "You shouldn't sneak up on people," she said, keeping the gun pointed carefully at the ground, but not lowering it entirely. "Especially people who are armed." "I wasn't sneaking," Lucian said, dismounting slowly so as not to spook her further. "I was riding the trail back to town and heard shooting. Thought maybe someone was in trouble." "Well, I'm not in trouble." Her chin lifted a fraction higher. "I'm practicing." "Practicing what exactly?" "Missing?" The flush that spread across her cheeks was immediate and vivid. "I'm teaching myself to shoot. Not that it's any of your business, mister." "Garrett, Lucian Garrett." He touched the brim of his hat. "And you are?" She hesitated, clearly debating whether to give him her name or tell him to mind his own affairs and ride on. Finally, she said, "Nora Hartley. I work at the schoolhouse in town." "The new teacher?" Lucian nodded. He'd heard about her arrival a few months back, though he'd been away on cattle drives for most of the spring and summer and hadn't had occasion to meet her. "What's a schoolteacher need with shooting lessons?" "What's a cowboy need with questioning a woman's business?" Nora shot back. Despite himself, Lucian felt a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough. But if you're going to teach yourself to shoot, you might want to start with the basics. Such as? Such as your stance." He moved closer, slowly, giving her plenty of time to tell him to stop if she wanted. She didn't. "You're standing all wrong. That's why your shots are going wide." Nora looked down at her feet, then back up at him with those honey-colored eyes. "What's wrong with how I'm standing?" "Everything. Near about." Lucian gestured toward the fallen log. "Try lining up a shot. Don't fire. Just show me what you do." She turned back toward the targets, raising the gun with both hands wrapped around the grip. Her feet were pressed together, her whole body rigid as a fence post, and she was leaning backward slightly, as if she expected the recoil to knock her flat. "See, there's your problem," Lucian said, moving to stand beside her. "You're fighting the gun before you even pull the trigger. May I?" "May you what?" "Show you the proper stance. I'd need to touch your shoulders, maybe adjust your feet, but I won't do it without your say-so." Nora studied him for a long moment, and Lucian could practically see her weighing her options. He was a stranger, and she was out here alone. She'd be a fool to trust him without question. But something in his face must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded. "All right, show me." Lucian stepped behind her, trying to ignore the faint scent of lavender soap that drifted from her hair. "First, your feet. Spread them apart about shoulder width and turn your left foot out just a bit like you're getting ready to take a step forward." She adjusted her stance, and he could feel her tension ease just slightly. "Good. Now your shoulders. You're all hunched up like you're expecting bad news." He placed his hands lightly on her shoulders and felt her stiffen again. "Easy. I'm just going to square you up." He gently guided her shoulders back and down, straightening her posture. "There. Feel that? You're not leaning back anymore." "It feels strange," Nora admitted. "It feels right. You were leaning back because you were afraid of the recoil, but if you stand solid, balanced, the gun's not going to knock you over." He moved to stand beside her again. "Now your grip. You're strangling that poor revolver like it owes you money." A startled laugh escaped her. "I didn't realize I was gripping it that hard. Your hands should be firm but not tense. Left hand supporting, right hand on the trigger. And don't lock your elbows. Keep them just a little bent, relaxed." He demonstrated with his own hands held up in the air. "See?" Nora mimicked his position, and he nodded approval. "Better. Now, when you aim, you don't want to rush it. Line up your sights with the target. Take a breath. Let it out slow. And squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." "That's a lot to remember," she said, but there was determination in her voice rather than discouragement. "It'll become natural once you practice. Go on, try it. And remember, you're balanced and solid. The gun's not your enemy." Nora raised the revolver, her stance much improved. She took her time lining up the shot, and Lucian could see her breathing slowly, deliberately. When she squeezed the trigger, the gun barked and one of the tin cans jumped off the log, spinning through the air before splashing into the river. The sound of pure delight that came from Nora was worth every dusty mile of his ride from Kansas City. She whirled to face him, her eyes bright with triumph. "I hit it, did you see that?" "I saw." Lucian couldn't help but smile at her excitement. "That was a good shot. Real good for someone teaching themselves. Because you showed me how to stand properly." She looked down at the gun in her hands, then back up at him. "Thank you. Truly. You're welcome. But one shot doesn't make you a shooter. You need to practice that stance until it's second nature, until you don't even have to think about it. Then I'll practice." Nora turned back toward the log, where 4 cans still remained. "May I? It's your ammunition." She set herself up again, taking care to position her feet and shoulders the way he'd shown her. This shot went wide, but not by much. The 3rd shot clipped the edge of a can, but didn't knock it over. The 4th went wide again. The 5th, though, the 5th was dead center. Another can flew off the log, and Nora's whoop of joy echoed across the river. Lucian watched her practice for another half hour, offering occasional advice, but mostly just letting her work through it herself. She was a quick learner. He'd give her that. Stubborn, too, which was probably why she'd been out here by herself in the first place, determined to figure it out without asking for help. When she finally ran out of ammunition, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Nora carefully unloaded the empty revolver and tucked it into a small carpet bag that had been sitting in the grass near where she'd been standing. "I should be getting back to town," she said, picking up the bag. "Mrs. Patterson will wonder where I've gone." I board with her above the mercantile. I'll ride with you, Lucian offered. It'll be dark soon, and it's not safe for a woman alone. Nora looked like she might argue, but then she nodded. Thank you, again. They walked back through the cottonwoods together, Lucian leading his horse. The animal nuzzled at Nora's shoulder, making her laugh, and she reached up to scratch behind his ears. What's his name? She asked. Copper, on account of his coloring. He's beautiful. He's a good horse. Patient. Doesn't spook easy. Lucian glanced at her. Can I ask you something? I suppose. Why are you teaching yourself to shoot? Council Bluffs is pretty tame these days. Not much call for a schoolteacher to be armed. Nora was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. I came here from Boston 6 months ago. I'd never been west of Pennsylvania in my life. And when I got off the train in Council Bluffs, I realized that everything I'd ever known was back east. My family, my friends, everything familiar. Out here, I have to rely on myself. That doesn't answer my question, doesn't it? I want to know I can take care of myself, that I'm not helpless if something goes wrong. Back in Boston, I was always someone's daughter, someone's niece, someone's student. Always protected, always watched over. I came out here to be my own person. That means learning to do things I never thought I'd need to know. Lucian nodded slowly. He understood that feeling better than she probably realized. Fair enough. But you don't have to do everything alone, you know. There's no shame in asking for help, says the man who clearly does everything alone. Nora cut her eyes at him. When's the last time you asked someone for help, Lucian Garrett? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. She had him there. Point taken. They emerged onto the main trail, and Lucian helped Nora up onto Copper's back before swinging up behind her. She went stiff for a moment, but then relaxed as he reached around her to take the reins. The ride into Council Bluffs took about 20 minutes, and they spent most of it in companionable silence. The town was bustling with evening activity when they arrived. Wagons rumbled down Main Street, and the saloons were already filling up with men looking to wash the dust from their throats. The smell of cooking food drifted from the hotel restaurant, making Lucian's stomach growl. He stopped Copper in front of the mercantile and helped Nora dismount. She looked up at him with those honey-colored eyes, and something in his chest tightened in a way he wasn't quite prepared for. Thank you for the lesson, she said, and for seeing me safely back. Any time. And Nora, if you want to practice more, I could meet you out there again. Give you some more pointers. Can't have the schoolteacher shooting up the countryside. A smile played at the corners of her mouth. I might take you up on that. Tomorrow afternoon, around 3 o'clock? Tomorrow afternoon, she agreed. Lucian touched his hat brim and turned Copper toward the livery stable, but he couldn't resist looking back once. Nora was still standing there, watching him ride away, and when their eyes met, she lifted her hand in a small wave before disappearing through the door that led up to her boarding room. He told himself the warmth spreading through his chest was just relief at being back in town after a long drive. But as he unsaddled Copper and rubbed the horse down for the night, Lucian couldn't stop thinking about the determined set of Nora's jaw when she lined up her shots, or the way her whole face lit up when she finally hit her target. The next afternoon, he was at the clearing by the river a good 15 minutes early, and he'd brought a box of ammunition with him. When Nora arrived right on time, she was wearing the same calico dress and carrying her carpet bag, but there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there yesterday. You came, she said, and he couldn't tell if she was surprised or pleased. Maybe both. Said I would, didn't I? Men say a lot of things. Fair enough. But I'm a man of my word. He held up the ammunition box. Brought you these. Can't practice without bullets. Nora's eyes widened. I can't accept that. Ammunition is expensive. Consider it an investment in public safety. Besides, I buy in bulk. Won't miss a box. She studied him for a moment, then took the box. Thank you. I'll pay you back. No need. Just show me you remember what I taught you yesterday. They spent the afternoon working on her shooting. Lucian set up a variety of targets at different distances, and he showed her how to adjust her aim for each one. He taught her about breathing, about patience, about the way the wind could affect a shot even over a short distance. Nora absorbed it all like a sponge, asking questions when something didn't make sense, practicing each technique until she got it right. By the time the sun started to sink, she was hitting her targets more often than not, and the proud smile on her face was something Lucian knew he'd remember for a long time. "You're a natural," he told her as they packed up for the evening. "Another few weeks of practice and you'll be better than half the men in town." "I doubt that, but I appreciate the flattery." She hesitated, then added, "Would you come again tomorrow? I learn so much faster with you here. I've got some work to do on the Callahan Ranch tomorrow, but day after tomorrow I could come. Day after tomorrow then." It became a routine over the next few weeks. Lucian would meet Nora at the clearing 3 or 4 times a week, and he'd watch her skills improve with each session. But it wasn't just about the shooting anymore, and they both knew it. They talked while she practiced, sharing pieces of their lives in the quiet moments between gunshots. He learned that she was 23 years old, the youngest of 4 children, and that she'd left Boston not just to be independent, but to escape the marriage her parents had been trying to arrange with a banker's son twice her age. She learned that he was 28, that he'd lost his parents to cholera when he was 16, and that he'd been working ranches and cattle drives ever since, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. "Don't you want a home?" Nora asked him one afternoon in mid-August. They were sitting in the shade of the cottonwoods, taking a break from the heat. "A place that's yours?" Lucian considered the question, turning it over in his mind. "I guess I never let myself want it. Seemed like the kind of thing that wasn't for people like me. Home is for folks with families, with something to build toward." "And you don't have anything to build toward?" "Didn't think I did." He looked at her, really looked at her, with her hair coming loose from its braid and a smudge of gunpowder on her cheek. "Maybe I was wrong about that." Something shifted in the air between them, something that had been building since that first day by the river. Nora held his gaze, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to read something written there. "Lucian," she said softly, and the way she said his name made his heart kick against his ribs. "Nora." He reached out and gently wiped the gunpowder smudge from her cheek with his thumb. Her skin was soft and warm beneath his touch. "I think I'm in danger of forgetting this is supposed to be about teaching you to shoot. I think I forgot that about 2 weeks ago," she admitted. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but then Nora's hand came up to rest against his chest, and Lucian pulled her closer, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. When they finally broke apart, Nora's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. "I didn't come out west looking for this," she said. "Neither did I, but I'm not complaining." "Neither am I." She laughed, the sound light and happy. "Though Mrs. Patterson is going to have questions if I come home looking like I've been kissed. Tell her you have been. Tell her I'm courting you properly if you'll let me." "Lucian Garrett, are you asking to court me?" "I am. Unless you think a dusty cowboy isn't good enough for a fancy Boston schoolteacher." Nora kissed him again, quick and sweet. "I think a dusty cowboy is exactly what this Boston schoolteacher needs." They courted properly after that, which in Council Bluffs in 1878 meant that Lucian took Nora to church socials and town dances, that he sat in her parlor at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house with the door properly open, that he walked her to the schoolhouse in the mornings and picked her up in the afternoons. They still met at the clearing by the river to practice shooting, but now those sessions were interspersed with stolen kisses and long conversations about the future. The town took notice, of course. A place as small as Council Bluffs didn't miss much, and the sight of Lucian Garrett, who'd been breaking hearts without meaning to since he was old enough to shave, settling down with the schoolteacher was cause for plenty of gossip and speculation. Most of it was good-natured, though there were a few women who'd had their eye on Lucian and weren't pleased to see him claimed. In September, when the air started to turn cool and the leaves on the cottonwoods began to yellow, Lucian took Nora on a picnic up into the hills east of town. They spread a blanket on a rise that overlooked the Missouri River and ate cold chicken and fresh bread while watching the sun paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. School started last week, Nora said, leaning back against Lucian's chest as he wrapped his arms around her. I have 17 students this year, 17 children who need to learn their letters and numbers and all the things that will help them make their way in the world. You're a good teacher. They're lucky to have you. I love it. I love seeing them understand something new, seeing their faces light up when something finally makes sense. She turned to look up at him. But I've been thinking about something. What's that? What happens when winter comes? You'll be going on cattle drives less, but there will still be work that takes you away from Council Bluffs. Days, maybe weeks at a time. And I'll be here teaching. That's how it works usually. I don't want that to be how it works for us. Nora sat up and turned to face him fully. I know it's only been a few months. I know it's probably too soon to be talking about this. But Lucian, I don't want to spend my life waiting for you to come back from wherever the work takes you. I want to build something with you, something permanent. Lucian's heart was pounding so hard he was surprised she couldn't hear it. What are you saying, Nora? I'm saying that I love you. I'm saying that I want a life with you. A real life, not just stolen afternoons by the river and Sunday socials. I'm saying that if you want that too, we should figure out how to make it happen. For a moment, Lucian couldn't speak. He'd spent 12 years drifting from one job to the next, never letting himself imagine a different kind of life. But sitting here with Nora, with her honey-colored eyes, looking at him with such fierce determination and hope, he could see it. A home, a family, roots that went deep enough to weather any storm. I love you too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've loved you since the day I saw you trying to shoot those tin cans and refusing to give up even though you were terrible at it. Nora laughed, even as tears started to spill down her cheeks. I was terrible, wasn't I? Absolutely awful, but you were also the most determined person I'd ever seen, and the most beautiful, and somewhere along the way you became the most important. He cupped her face in his hands, brushing away her tears with his thumbs. Marry me, Nora. Let me build that life with you. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They were married in October, on a crisp autumn afternoon, when the whole town turned out to see the Cowboy, and the schoolteacher pledged their lives to each other. Nora wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and Lucian wore his best suit with a string tie and boots polished until they gleamed. They spoke their vows in the small church on the corner of Main and Third, with the minister's wife playing a slightly out-of-tune piano and sunlight streaming through the windows to paint everything in gold. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the church hall with food provided by half the women in town and dancing that lasted until well after dark. Lucien danced with his new wife until his feet ached, and even then he didn't want to stop, because holding Nora in his arms and knowing she was his felt like the greatest gift he'd ever been given. They spent their first night as husband and wife in a room at the hotel, the nicest accommodation Council Bluffs had to offer. It wasn't fancy by Boston standards, Nora assured him with a laugh, but it was clean and comfortable, and theirs. In the morning, they would move into the small house Lucien had purchased on the edge of town, a 2-room cabin that needed work but had good bones and enough land for a garden and a barn. But that night, wrapped in each other's arms while the sounds of the town filtered through the window, they talked about the future, about the life they would build together, the children they hoped to have, the way they would support and challenge and love each other through whatever came. I never thought I'd have this, Lucien admitted, his hand tracing lazy patterns on Nora's shoulder. A wife, a home, a reason to stay put. I thought I'd always be drifting. You're not drifting anymore, Nora said. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. So are you. No more running from Boston bankers. No more running at all. Just building together. The winter of 1878 was mild by Iowa standards, with more rain than snow and temperatures that rarely dropped below freezing. Lucian took work when he could find it, hiring on with local ranchers for day wages and helping with repairs around town. It wasn't the big money of the cattle drives, but it was steady, and more importantly, it kept him close to home, close to Nora. She continued teaching through the winter, trudging through mud and occasional snow to reach the schoolhouse each morning. Lucian walked her there when he could, and he always met her at the end of the day. On the weekends, they worked on fixing up their little house, adding shelves and curtains and all the small touches that turned a building into a home. They also continued their shooting practice, though less frequently as the weather grew colder and the days shorter. Nora had become an excellent shot, better than many of the men Lucian knew, and she took pride in her skill. She kept her revolver in a drawer by the bed, not because she expected trouble, but because she liked knowing it was there, that she could protect herself and her home if needed. In March, when the first green shoots of spring began to push through the mud, Nora told Lucian she was pregnant. They were eating breakfast at their small kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the window, and Lucian nearly choked on his coffee when she said the words. "You're sure?" he asked when he could speak again. "I'm sure. The baby should come in October, around our anniversary." Lucian got up and pulled Nora into his arms, holding her tight while his mind reeled with the magnitude of it. A baby, his baby, their baby. "Are you happy?" he asked, because suddenly that seemed like the most important question in the world. "I'm terrified," Nora admitted, her voice muffled against his chest. "And excited. And so incredibly happy I can barely stand it." "Me too. All of those things all at once." They spent the spring preparing for the baby's arrival. Lucian built a cradle out of oak, carving simple patterns along the sides and sanding it until it was smooth as glass. Nora sewed tiny gowns and blankets, and Mrs. Patterson donated a stack of cloth diapers she'd saved from when her own children were small. The women of the town rallied around Nora, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and stories about their own experiences with childbirth. Nora taught school through the end of May, when the term ended for the summer. By then, her belly was beginning to show, and the children had figured out that there was going to be a baby. They were alternately excited and confused, asking questions about where babies came from that made Nora blush and laugh at the same time. Summer brought the heat back, thick and heavy air that made everything slow down. Nora spent much of her time in the shade of their porch, reading or sewing or just watching Lucian work in the garden he'd planted behind the house. They had tomatoes and beans and squash, more vegetables than two people could eat, but Nora preserved what they didn't use right away, putting up jars of pickles and tomato sauce for the winter. In August, Lucian was offered a spot on a cattle drive heading down to Omaha, just a week-long trip with good pay. Normally, he would have jumped at the chance, but he hesitated, looking at Nora with concern. "Take it," she said before he could even ask the question. "We need the money, and I'm not due for 2 more months. I'll be fine." "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Mrs. Patterson will look in on me, and half the women in town stop by every day anyway. I won't be alone." Lucian took the job, but spent the entire week worrying about Nora. He pushed the cattle hard, determined to get the drive finished as quickly as possible so he could get back home. When he finally rode into Council Bluffs 6 days later, tired and dusty and eager to see his wife, he found her sitting on the porch with Mrs. Patterson, both women laughing at something one of them had said. "You see," Nora said when she saw the relief on his face, "I told you I'd be fine." "I know, but I still worried." "Well, don't. I'm tougher than I look." He kissed her, not caring that Mrs. Patterson was sitting right there watching with amusement. "I know that too, but I'm still going to worry. That's part of the job description for a husband." September arrived with cooler temperatures and the promise of autumn in the air. Nora's belly was large now, and she moved more slowly, her hand often pressed to the small of her back. Lucian made sure she didn't do any heavy lifting, and he took over most of the household chores, despite her protests that she wasn't an invalid. "I know you're not," he said, guiding her to a chair, "but I'm trying to take care of you. Let me do that, please." "You take very good care of me," Nora said, reaching up to touch his face. "Better than I ever imagined anyone would." The baby came on October 15th, 2 weeks before their first anniversary. Nora's labor started in the early morning hours, and Lucian rode through the pre-dawn darkness to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Patterson. The next 12 hours were the longest of his life, pacing the floor of their little house while Nora labored in the bedroom with the doctor and Mrs. Patterson attending her. When he finally heard the baby's cry, thin and indignant, Lucian felt his knees go weak with relief. Mrs. Patterson came out a few minutes later, wiping her hands on her apron and smiling. "You have a son," she said, "a healthy boy with a good set of lungs. And Nora is fine, tired but fine. You can go in now." Lucian found Nora propped up in bed, exhausted and sweaty, and more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket, and when she pulled the blanket back to show him their son, Lucian felt something crack open in his chest. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with dark hair plastered to his head and tiny fists waving in the air. He was perfect. "We have a son," Nora said, her voice full of wonder. "Look at him, Lucian. Look what we made." Lucian sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. Tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, gripping with surprising strength, and Lucian felt tears prick at his eyes. "He's perfect," he managed to say. "You're perfect. I don't know what I did to deserve this, but I'm grateful for it every single day." "What should we name him?" Nora asked. They'd discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Lucian knew exactly what felt right. "Thomas," he said, "after my father, Thomas Garrett." Nora smiled. "Thomas Garrett? I like it. Welcome to the world, Thomas." The baby settled into their lives with surprising ease, considering how much everything changed. Nora was a natural mother, patient and loving even when Thomas woke them 3 times a night. Lucian discovered that he loved being a father more than he'd ever imagined possible. He loved the weight of his son in his arms, the way Thomas would stare up at him with solemn blue eyes, the tiny sounds the baby made that weren't quite words yet, but seemed full of meaning. Money was tight with only one income and a new mouth to feed, but they managed. Lucian took whatever work he could find, and Nora talked about returning to teaching once Thomas was older. They ate simply and saved carefully, and they were happy. The first anniversary of their wedding came and went with a quiet celebration at home. They couldn't afford a fancy dinner or expensive gifts, but Lucian gave Nora a necklace he'd made himself, a simple silver chain with a pendant in the shape of a flower. Nora gave him a new shirt she'd sewn, with careful stitching and buttons she'd traded eggs for at the mercantile. "This is better than I ever imagined my life could be," Nora said that evening, sitting in their little parlor with Thomas asleep in her arms. "A year ago, I was standing up in front of God and everyone, promising to love you forever. I meant it then, but I didn't fully understand what it would mean. Now I do. This, right here, this is everything." "It is," Lucian agreed, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. "And it's only going to get better." Winter came again, and this time Lucian didn't take any work that would keep him away from home for more than a day. He couldn't bear the thought of missing even a moment of Thomas's growth, the way the baby was learning new things every day. First smiles, then laughs that sounded like hiccups, then the beginnings of real babbling that might someday turn into words. In the spring, when Thomas was 6 months old, the town council approached Nora about taking up teaching again. The woman who'd replaced her had gotten married and moved away, and they needed someone to finish out the term. "I want to," Nora told Lucian that evening. "I miss teaching, but I don't want to be away from Thomas all day either." "What if we brought him with you?" Lucian suggested. Set up a cradle in the corner of the schoolhouse. The students would probably love having a baby around, and you could feed him and tend to him between lessons. Nora's face lit up. Do you think the town council would allow it? Won't know unless we ask. The council agreed, and Nora returned to teaching in April 1880, with Thomas installed in his cradle in the corner of the schoolhouse. The students were fascinated by the baby, and Nora turned it into teachable moments, having them practice their arithmetic by figuring out how many ounces of milk Thomas drank in a day, or their writing skills by composing stories about adventures the baby might have when he grew up. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Lucian worked, Nora taught. Thomas grew. They had challenges, of course. Money was sometimes scarce, and there were illnesses and injuries and all the normal difficulties of life. But they faced everything together, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating the good ones. When Thomas was 2 years old, walking and talking and getting into everything he could reach, Nora told Lucian she was pregnant again. This time, the news felt different, not less exciting, but more grounded. The joy mixed with a practical understanding of what was to come. The second baby, another boy they named Daniel after Nora's father, was born in January 1882 during a snowstorm that shut down the town for 3 days. Lucian delivered his own son with Mrs. Patterson shouting instructions through the window, unable to get to their house through the drifts. It was terrifying and messy, and when it was over, Lucian held Daniel in his arms and marveled at the fact that he'd helped bring this life into the world with his own hands. You did so well, he told Nora afterward, washing her face with a cool cloth. You're the strongest person I've ever known. I had good help, she said, smiling weakly. Even if you did look like you might faint at one point. I thought about it, he admitted. But then I figured you needed me more than I needed to fall on the floor. 2 boys meant even less sleep and even more work, but also twice the laughter and twice the love. Thomas was fascinated by his baby brother, constantly wanting to help feed or change or entertain Daniel. The house felt full in the best possible way, bursting with life and noise and the beautiful chaos of family. Nora took a year off from teaching after Daniel was born, wanting to focus on the boys while they were so young. Money was tighter than ever, but Lucian picked up extra work where he could, and they made it through. They always made it through. In the summer of 1883, Lucian was offered a job as foreman on the Callahan Ranch, the biggest spread in the area. It meant steady pay, good money, and respect in the community. It also meant longer hours and more responsibility. But Lucian didn't hesitate. His family needed security, and this job offered that. The boys thrived. Thomas started school when he turned 6, sitting in his mother's classroom and learning his letters with fierce concentration. Daniel, who had inherited his father's restless energy, was constantly climbing trees and chasing chickens and generally keeping Nora on her toes. They were healthy and happy, and watching them grow was the greatest joy of Lucian's life. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Thomas learned to ride a horse at 7, Daniel at 5. Both boys were taught to shoot by their mother, who remained an excellent markswoman and insisted that her sons learn proper gun safety from the start. Family shooting practice became a Sunday tradition when the weather was good, all 4 of them heading out to the clearing by the river where it had all begun. Remember the first time I saw you out here? Lucian asked Nora one Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1888. The boys were setting up tin cans on the fallen log, arguing good-naturedly about the best placement. You couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. I could too, Nora protested, then laughed. Well, maybe not, but I was determined to learn. You were determined to do everything yourself. Took me fixing your stance before you'd admit you needed help. Best help I ever accepted. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. Look at them. Look at our boys. Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that this is our life. It's real. We built it together, piece by piece. That fall, Thomas turned 10 and announced that he wanted to be a rancher like his father. Daniel, 8 years old and full of opinions, declared that he wanted to be a lawyer and moved to a big city like Chicago or St. Louis. Nora and Lucian exchanged amused glances over their sons' heads, knowing that both boys would probably change their minds a dozen times before they were grown. In 1890, the country was changing. More people were moving west, and Council Bluffs was growing from a small frontier town into a real city. There was talk of electric lights being installed on Main Street, and the railroad had expanded its service, making it easier than ever to travel. The wild days of the West were giving way to civilization, to progress, to a more settled way of life. Nora went back to teaching full-time once both boys were in school, and she became known as one of the best educators in the county. Parents requested that their children be placed in her classroom, knowing that Mrs. Garrett would be firm but fair, challenging but encouraging. She loved her work, but she never let it take precedence over her family. Her boys and her husband always came first. Lucian continued as foreman at the Callahan Ranch, earning a reputation for fairness and competence that made him invaluable to the operation. He was offered a partnership stake in 1892, a recognition of his years of hard work and dedication. It wasn't a large share, but it was enough to provide real security for his family and to give him a voice in how the ranch was run. The boys continued to grow, becoming young men who were kind and capable and everything parents could hope for. Thomas did indeed become interested in ranching, spending his free time working alongside his father and learning the business from the ground up. Daniel's interests shifted from law to medicine, and he began talking about attending the university in Iowa City when he was old enough. In the summer of 1895, Nora and Lucian celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary by taking a trip, just the two of them, leaving the boys in Mrs. Patterson's capable care for a week. They traveled to Kansas City, staying in a hotel that was far nicer than anything they'd ever experienced, eating in restaurants and attending the theater, and just enjoying being together without the responsibilities of children and work. "Do you ever miss it?" Nora asked one evening as they walked along the streets of Kansas City, her arm linked through his. "The freedom you had before we met? The cattle drives, the traveling, the lack of responsibilities?" Lucian stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Not for a single second. That wasn't freedom, Nora. That was loneliness disguised as independence. You gave me something real to build, a reason to stay in one place. You gave me a home and a family, and a life worth living. I wouldn't trade that for anything." Tears glimmered in Nora's eyes. "I love you, Lucian Garrett. I loved you when you were just a dusty cowboy who stopped to help a foolish woman who couldn't shoot straight. And I love you even more now. I love you too. Always have. Always will." They returned to Council Bluffs refreshed and reconnected, ready to dive back into the beautiful chaos of family life. Thomas, at 15, had grown another 3 inches while they were gone and was rapidly becoming taller than his father. Daniel, at 13, had gotten into a fight at school defending a younger student from bullies and had a black eye to show for it. Both boys claimed they'd been perfect angels, but Mrs. Patterson's account told a different story. "They're good boys," she assured Nora and Lucian. "A little wild, maybe, but good hearts through and through. You've raised them well." The turn of the century came with celebration and speculation about what the new era would bring. Thomas was 18 now, working full-time on the ranch and saving money to eventually buy his own land. Daniel was 16 and doing exceptionally well in school, his dream of becoming a doctor looking more achievable every day. Nora, at 45, still taught school and still practiced her shooting on Sunday afternoons. Her hair was threaded with silver now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of smiling. But to Lucian, she was as beautiful as the day he'd first seen her trying to hit those tin cans. Lucian himself was 50, his dark hair gone mostly gray and his hands showing the wear of decades of hard work. But he was healthy and strong, and he thanked God every day for the life he'd been given. In 1903, Thomas married a sweet girl named Emily, who'd grown up on a neighboring ranch. The wedding was held at the same church where Lucian and Nora had been married 25 years earlier, and standing there watching his son pledge his life to the woman he loved Lucian felt the circle of life completing itself in the most satisfying way. We're getting old, Nora whispered to him during the reception. Speak for yourself. I'm in my prime. She laughed and kissed his cheek. We're grandparents in waiting. That's old. That's blessed, he corrected. That's lucky beyond measure. The first grandchild, a little girl named Sarah, arrived in 1904, and Lucian discovered that being a grandfather was every bit as wonderful as being a father had been. Daniel graduated from high school that same year and was accepted to the medical program at the state university, his dreams one step closer to reality. Life continued its forward march. More grandchildren arrived, 4 in total over the next several years. Daniel completed his medical training and returned to Council Bluffs to open a practice, determined to serve the community that had raised him. Thomas and Emily bought a small ranch of their own, with financial help from Lucian and determination to build something lasting. In 1910, Nora retired from teaching after 32 years in the classroom. The town threw her a retirement party, and dozens of her former students came to thank her for the education and encouragement she'd provided over the years. It was a bittersweet day, saying goodbye to work she'd loved, but she was ready to spend more time with her family and less time worrying about lesson plans and school supplies. Lucian himself was talking about retiring from the ranch, though he wasn't quite ready to give up work entirely. At 60, he was slowing down but still capable, still needed. The Callahan Ranch had become partly his over the years, his partnership stake growing with his contributions, and the thought of walking away entirely felt strange. But then one evening in late autumn, sitting on their porch watching the sun set over the Missouri River, Nora turned to him and said, "Let's do it. Let's both retire properly. We've worked hard all our lives. Don't we deserve some time to just enjoy what we've built?" Lucian looked at his wife, her face gilded by the golden light of the setting sun, and realized she was right. They'd spent more than 30 years building a life together, raising children, working jobs, contributing to their community. They'd earned the right to slow down, to savor the fruits of all that labor. "All right," he said, "let's do it. We'll retire properly and spend our time spoiling grandchildren and driving our sons crazy with unsolicited advice." Nora laughed, the sound as bright and joyful as it had been when she was 23 and first learning to shoot. "That sounds perfect." They sold Lucian's partnership in the ranch to the Callahan family's youngest son, who'd taken over running the operation. The money from the sale, combined with what they'd saved over the years, was enough to live on comfortably for the rest of their lives. They kept their little house on the edge of town, the 2-room cabin that had grown over the years, into a proper home with additions and improvements. Retirement suited them. They spent their days tending a large garden, visiting with friends, watching their grandchildren grow. Lucian took up woodworking, crafting toys for the grandchildren and furniture for anyone who asked. Nora joined a quilting circle and discovered she had a talent for it, her quilts becoming treasured family heirlooms. And every Sunday afternoon, weather permitting, they would walk down to the clearing by the river, just the two of them. Nora would bring her revolver, the same one she'd been teaching herself to shoot with all those years ago, and they would practice for an hour or so, the sound of gunshots echoing across the water, just like old times. "Remember the first day?" Nora asked one Sunday in the spring of 1913. They were both in their late 60s now, moving a bit slower but still sharp, still capable. "Remember how terrible I was?" "I remember how determined you were," Lucian said. "I remember thinking you were the stubbornest woman I'd ever met, and the prettiest. You fixed my stance and changed my life. You let me, which changed mine." They stood together in the clearing, these two people who'd built a life from nothing but determination and love. The Wild West they'd known in their youth was gone, replaced by progress and civilization. But the essential things, the things that mattered most, remained unchanged. Love, family, commitment, the choice to stand beside someone through all of life's challenges and joys. "I'd do it all again," Nora said softly. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy." I'd choose you every single time. And I'd stop every single time I heard those shots, even knowing how terrible you were at first. Lucian wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her close. Best decision I ever made. They stayed like that for a long moment, two people who'd grown old together and wouldn't have had it any other way. Around them, the cottonwood trees whispered in the breeze, and the Missouri River flowed on as it always had, constant and eternal. The world kept changing, but their love remained, as steady and true as the day they'd first admitted it to each other in this very spot. The years continued to pass, gentle and kind. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1928, surrounded by their sons and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. It was a grand party, held in the church hall where their wedding reception had been so many years before, and the whole town turned out to celebrate the couple who become something of a legend in Council Bluffs. The Cowboy and the Schoolteacher, they were called, and their love story was told to children and grandchildren as an example of what marriage could be when built on respect and partnership and genuine affection. Lucian passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1932 at the age of 82. He'd lived a full life, a good life, and he'd been surrounded by family and love right to the end. Nora grieved deeply for the man who'd been her partner for more than half a century, but she didn't break. She'd learned long ago how to be strong, how to face whatever came with determination and grace. She lived another 5 years, spending her time with her family and maintaining the traditions she and Lucian had established over their lifetime together. Every Sunday, weather permitting, she would walk down to the clearing by the river by herself, bringing her revolver and practicing her shooting. She was 90 years old, and her hands weren't as steady as they once were, but she could still hit her targets more often than not. And sometimes, standing there in the dappled sunlight beneath the cottonwood trees, she could almost feel Lucian standing behind her, his hands on her shoulders, adjusting her stance the way he had so long ago. She could hear his voice telling her to breathe, to relax, to trust herself. And she could feel the love that had sustained them through more than 50 years together, as real and present as it had ever been. Nora Hartley Garrett passed away in her sleep in the summer of 1937, surrounded by photographs of her family and holding a locket that contained a picture of Lucian from their wedding day. She was 90 years old, and she'd lived a life full of purpose and meaning and love. At her funeral, Daniel, now a respected doctor and grandfather himself, told the story of how his parents met. He spoke of the determined schoolteacher teaching herself to shoot by the river and the cowboy who stopped to help her. He talked about how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love story that spanned decades and touched countless lives. They showed us what it means to build a life together, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just to fall in love, but to choose love every single day, through good times and hard times. They showed us that real partnership means supporting each other's dreams, fixing each other's stance when needed, and always making time for practice. The family buried Nora next to Lucian in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Council Bluffs. On their shared headstone, beneath their names and dates, was a simple inscription that Thomas had chosen. They taught each other to aim true. And in the clearing by the river, beneath the cottonwood trees that had witnessed the beginning of their love story, the tin cans still sometimes appeared on the fallen log. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren would bring them, along with their carefully maintained antique revolvers, and they would practice their shooting while sharing stories about the cowboy and the schoolteacher who'd started it all. Because some love stories don't just endure a lifetime. They create a legacy that continues for generations, teaching everyone who hears them that the most important things in life aren't about where you start or how skilled you are when you begin. They're about having the determination to keep trying, the humility to accept help when it's offered, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the person who fixes your stance also fixes your heart, and that when you find that person, you hold on tight and you practice every single day until being together becomes as natural as breathing. the story of Lucian and Nora Garrett became part of the fabric of Council Bluffs, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But to their descendants, who inherited their determination and their capacity for love, it was something more than a story. It was a roadmap for how to live, a reminder that the best things in life often start with the simple decision to stop and help someone who's struggling, and that sometimes when you fix someone's stance, you end up finding your forever.